Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Mark, for those beautifully aligned readings with the energy of creativity. And also, I find that I have twinned that energy of creativity in finishing up our message from last week about using Genesis as a blueprint to create in the womb, that is our consciousness, whatever it is that we're seeking to express or create more of. Before I start this morning, I was very touched this week to officiate at the funeral of my friend of many, many years who made his transition. And it brought up a question that I had heard Seinfeld somehow make fun of. So I'm going to share this for our laughter to begin this morning, because as Charles Fillmore reminded his audience, laughter makes the heart light and brittle thoughts make the bones hard. So we're going to laugh. Also, just so you know, I very much align with Seinfeld in the part of what he makes fun of here. He says, I don't cook. I do have a kitchen. I've been in it. To me, a kitchen is just a big room to hold a toaster. That's the way I think of my apartment: bedroom, living room, toaster room. Then he says, in the winter, I turn the dial up on the toaster to make it darker. In summer, I turn it down. I like it a little more on the light side. And that's about as much into cuisine as I get. Then he says, here's my other home cooking concern. It has to do with using a plate that's too big, because then I have to wash the unutilized plate area. And I hate washing a plate that didn't have food on it. This is really just throwing my life away. I mean, I'm wetting it, I'm soaking it, I'm rinsing it, and then drying it. It didn't even do anything. These are the things that add up in your life and later make you say, where did all the time go? So hopefully we are embracing joy and our spiritual power for the month of August, which is the right use of our spiritual power of will, so that when we face the next transitional phase of our life, we will be ready and we will be joyful and grateful in knowing where all the time went and how well spent it was indeed. It was very, very instructional for me to officiate John's funeral, because in his departure, he was very much the same way that he was in life, which was illumined, grateful, and above all, giving everything the light touch, as we say in unity. Just before the formal service began, his daughter came to find me, and it takes a lot to ruffle her because she's John's daughter. And she said, oh my God, Roz, you wouldn't believe it. She said, I spent hours and hours at Walmart loading pictures for this service onto this brand new USB stick. And somehow it's showing my grandparents' cruise, which would be John's ex-in-laws. And so right away, I just burst out laughing. And she kind of looked at me and I said, honey, your dad teased you all the time. Can't you feel him here? He's saying, ha ha. She said, no, but you don't get it. She said, I don't even know how this happens. I'm like, exactly. That's how we know it's otherworldly. And so the funeral people were kind of in her energy of anxiety, because they said the only guy who can fix this is Charlie. And Charlie is washing the limousine right now. So they phoned him, told him to get right back, and it was rectified. But John wasn't finished letting us know at the celebration of his life that he really hasn't gone anywhere. He just dropped his body that it was time to do that. So just about near the end, I believe, of the service, Karen had selected a song called Heroes that she wanted to play as a tribute to her dad, who definitely is her hero. And so I'm standing at the podium inviting her to come up to play this song, Heroes. And she looks at me just completely aghast and shakes her head no. And so, of course, I didn't match that vibration. I just stayed in the energy of knowing all was well. I said, you know what? Karen has planned a song called Heroes for her dad, and her dad might actually have another idea. So, of course, we just enjoyed that. And at that moment, Karen's cousin jumped up from the back of the chapel and came forward and played the song Heroes for us. What am I creating in consciousness moment by moment? That is really the crux of this two-part talk. Last Sunday, we looked at the first part of the creation story in Genesis. I will review what the symbols, the metaphysical attributes of the creation story are and how they apply to our daily lives before looking at the last part of the Genesis creation story and applying it to any womb of creation, really. So in our metaphysical appreciation of timeless literature, which includes Holy Scripture, we are called upon to make the message in the Scripture beyond the practical aspect of the words. We are called upon to make the message of the timeless literature our own. And in going forth into this metaphysical interpretation of Scripture, I'm going to start by reading the section that today's message is really speaking to, understanding that last week we left off at, and God made the beasts of the earth after their kind, the cattle, and everything that creeps upon the earth after its kind, and God saw that it was good. So I'm now on verse 26 of First Genesis. Verse 26. And then God said, let us make man in our image and our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, the fowl of the air. Hold on to that one, because that fowl image comes up later. Over cattle and all the wild beasts of the earth, and over everything that creeps upon the earth. In the next couple of verses, God says, behold, I have given you every herb yielding seed, which is upon the face of all the earth, and every tree which bears fruit yielding seed. And to you it shall be for food. To every beast of the earth, every bird of the air, and everything that creeps upon the earth wherein there is life, I have given every green herb for food. And it was so. And God saw everything that he had made, and behold, it was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day, and the heavens and the earth were finished. And on the sixth day, God finished his works, and he rested on the seventh day from all his works which he had made. So just to create a context for us of the first part of Genesis, we are introduced first to the first step in creation consciousness. That is to say, when we are deliberately, consciously aligning with God to allow God's will to create whatever it is in our lives, the first step is to let there be light. How do we do that? What does that light represent? I believe it behooves every one of us to answer that question for ourselves. For me, when I sit and let there be light, let's say that the last couple of weeks I was sitting to create understanding of a situation that came up. And because I believe with every fiber of my being that everything happens for me, not to me, I sat and said, let there be light shed on this situation of my windshield suddenly exploding on me. I was driving very slowly in a school zone, and suddenly that happened. And right away, an angel of God from a tennis court came over and asked me if I was okay. And I said, oh, yes, I'm fine. I got out of the car and shook all the confetti of glass off me. And she said, wow, did you see that? And I said, no. She said, that golf ball from right there must have been going 200 miles an hour when it hit your windshield. And so I use that example only as something that I very recently have applied this creationism in consciousness to. What am I seeking to create all the time in consciousness? The peace of God, spiritual understanding, and the will of God to be done in my life. Because I know that the will of God is absolute good for me, I sit in the quiet and say, let there be light. May I see the gift in this golf ball, which of course, once we say, let there be light, immediately the second symbol from Genesis comes up, which is let there be a firmament. And firmament is what is solid, is what is unshakable, is what is our foundation. And that's faith. So either I believe that everything happens for me and I go into any situation wanting to create understanding, spiritual understanding, or not. So I could sit and let there be light all day long, but without faith, I'm not sure that what I'm seeking to create, which is peace of mind and align with God's will, because obviously that was God's will for me that day. Then the second image from the creation story is waters, the waters upon the land. And Fillmore in the Revealing Word talks about waters being ideas that can be scattered and that must be placed under the governance of divine mind. And then, of course, the dry land, which comes next in the creation story, represents the demonstration, the manifestation. So did I receive spiritual guidance, spiritual understanding by sitting with my golf ball gift? Yes, because I expected it and I gave forth only the energy of receptivity to God's will. Show me what this is for. So the manifestation comes through the two lights that are next mentioned in the creation story, and that is the light of day that God creates and the light of night. We mentioned just briefly last week that these two images from the creation story apply to whatever it is that we're seeking to expand in our own consciousness through creating more of it. And so the day represents the spiritual faculty of understanding, and it must come first before we can invoke our power of will. And so with these two powers of understanding and will, we will have created what it is that we set to create in consciousness. And I can assure you that this particular blueprint of letting there be light, of the firmament, which is my unwavering faith, of my believing that all of my ideas from my human intellect must be dispersed so that the ideas from divine mind can manifest as represented by the dried land. And then to be able to say, not my will, but thine be done, because certainly in driving to check on my folks that day, it was not my human will to have that interrupted by the windshield exploding. However, because I know that God's will for me is always absolute good, I accept that through the firmament of my faith, and then I'm able to create through harnessing my spiritual powers of will and understanding a manifestation. So it didn't take too long once I allowed the birds that fly above. So in the Genesis story, the birds that fly above are in juxtaposition to the creeping creatures. And I'm sure you can imagine that the fowl of the air, the birds that God created, are symbols of our thoughts when they are under the governance of our indwelling Christ, of our indwelling presence, the presence that unites us all. And so any of those creeping creatures, any of those low vibrating thoughts must be, and yes, you notice scripture assures us they'll swarm, right? What does that verb imply? Well, for me, swarming means that one could become enveloped by it, surrounded. However, through recognizing that the birds fly high above those creeping creatures, I can give power to the high thoughts that the birds represent and open my mind. And so as I sat dispelling very deliberately all those swarming creatures that thought that they were going to intrude into my consciousness, and notice it's a deliberate act, because as long as we're in this particular spacesuit, in this holy temple, those swarming thoughts are going to show up. So it has to be very deliberate in prayer, in sitting in the silence with this blueprint for creating, meaning this creationism in consciousness, which is following a very clear blueprint for any kind of womb of creation in consciousness. So I align my thoughts. I deliberately dispel anything unlike love, unlike God's will, unlike spiritual understanding, and open my soul up to receive what high thoughts will reveal to me, so that I can understand and I can find the gift in everything in my life. So what came through after just about 7 days of this process of creating in consciousness, meaning what came was the 7th day, which of course we know is the day of rest. It is the Sabbath. Above all else, the Sabbath represents letting go. It is a symbol of it is done. I've done my part. I came. I let there be light in my consciousness. I invoked my faith, which is unwavering. I recognized all the different ideas represented by waters. I recognize the invitation from Christ in me to invoke the powers of will and understanding. And in so doing, I can understand the difference between those swarming thoughts and God thoughts, which are allowed to come through with the light of understanding. They come through as the symbol of the birds high above everything impermanent, high above the seduction of appearances, and creating a narrative about whatever happens for us. It's very, very seductive to create a narrative instead of to open to truth. And certainly the time that I've spent in my life telling stories, it is very tempting for me to create a narrative of, when it first hit that golf ball, I had no idea it was a golf ball. That's why I called the lady from the tennis court an angel, because angels are messengers from God. So she had somehow witnessed the force of that coming for me. And you notice my very deliberate use of the preposition for. In the race consciousness, there is embedded the belief that things happen to us, which creates a victim consciousness. It's just a law. It's a spiritual law. For God is no respecter of persons. So if I'm going to create in the womb, that is my consciousness, the notion that things happen to me, then certainly it will lead to victim consciousness. Well, I don't know about you, but I have suffered just enough that I have no desire to go there. So it's very easy for me to say, wow, this is happening for me. I can't wait to go home and sit in the silence, in the womb of creation that is my consciousness, and have it revealed to me from Christ in me what this is for. And perhaps the last step, the seventh day, many of you are long-standing metaphysicians, and so you know that the number 7 comes directly in its metaphysical meaning from this first story of creation. And 7 is a number metaphysically that represents completion. It represents it is done. It is finished. And is it? And this is the key. When we are creating in consciousness a surrender that ends after the 7 steps, and I'm going to repeat them right now so that if you decide that you want to go back to First Genesis and find out what the key symbols represent for you as you sit in prayer, creating a consciousness of oneness with God, the 7th step, it is finished, it is done, is really what we call in unity, let go, and let God. And I can tell you that without consistent practice, that part becomes the hardest part, because our wonderful ego that we talked about last week is right there on the scene, wanting to make up a narrative instead of be open to a creation story that is from God, of God, and for me. And so I share with you that if you have noticed that the last step when you sit in prayer to open your consciousness to spiritual understanding so that your power of will might be put under the governance of God, having done all that, it might seem like the final step of letting go is the easiest one. In fact, that's why last week I talked about my having been in the practice of non-resistance. So what happens? I'm almost there. I've come through letting there be light, recognizing my faith, which is the foundation of creating anything, knowing that lots of ideas will be scattered in one place and that it's up to me to harness them under the governance of God so that dry land may appear, so that in my humanness, I will manifest some meaning, some understanding that I'm seeking by creating this consciousness. And so then guess what? Then here come the swarming, creeping crawlers of the outer world. And that's when I need to remember in the story that the 6th step is the creation of the birds, which stand for God thoughts. And we heard Mark's reading about God thoughts being very different from ours. And that's very important to remember, that if I am open to only God thoughts, it's very important to surrender and to let go of the creepy crawlers. And above all, to recognize, as I mentioned last week, how is it that ego shows up to particularly individually tempt me? I mean, any and all attempts by the ego to take us hostage, we recognize are the same thing. They're all fear. And whatever is not love is fear. However, it is our spiritual responsibility. I know it's my spiritual responsibility to have witnessed, observed, and noticed over half a lifetime, wow, how does it show up to tempt me? Well, for me, I always get seduced by the ego trying to come up with logic, the wonderful intellect, and start a narrative that is not aligned with truth. And so letting go, surrendering, allowing the Sabbath to live in the womb of my consciousness is the final step. And so let's just let these 7 steps be repeated and perhaps call to mind now the womb of your own creation, which is your consciousness. And notice any non-resistance to the truth that each of us is a co-creator with God. Those creepy crawlers, those thoughts that are not God thoughts, are very much thoughts that we are in charge of. Our spiritual responsibility is first to invite the light of Christ to illumine my consciousness. And so a prayer that I often say to invoke that light when I first sit is, I am now allowing the Christ mind to reveal the truth to me. I am now allowing the Christ mind to reveal the truth to me. And for me, that's let there be light. With the second step, let there be a firmament. I need to build my faith up continuously. And so in sitting, I must review my attitude and notice that it is trusting that leads to knowing with an inner conviction that the right and desired outcome to my sitting, creating with God is mine. It's just beyond question. I know with my inner conviction that this truth will be revealed to me from my Christ mind because I have let there be light. So we've got let there be light. We've got a firmament of faith, which is the bedrock of trusting God with my whole life. And then we do allow the ideas to take shape in our imaginations. We do visualize a desired result in the external. But in the example that I used with you, that what I was seeking to create in consciousness was spiritual understanding by submitting my will to God, I can create what are the desired results by holding only positive images and pictures in my mind. And so in the case of this experience for me, what I held in mind with gratitude was the fact that I was able to resist not any of the stuff that was bound to come with trying to replace that windshield. So the people at the golf course said, well, there's no liability. Then I went to the windshield guy and he said, oh my God, you're so lucky it's not that infernal heat. And then he wanted to bring the power of his spoken word to how much worse it could be. So of course I simply lifted to bird thoughts. I saw birds in my mind before I even came home and sat in the womb of creation. I just thought, this is happening for me. I'm so grateful. I can't wait to see the gift. And so let there be light in the dome of the sky to separate day from night. What are these two lights? We've already said it. They are spiritual gifts of will and of understanding. So these two lights in consciousness they represent, metaphysically, they are symbols of the faculty of both will and understanding. We need those. We need those to keep clear the things of day. I can't wait to see the gift in this windshield from the night, the things of the flesh. And so I put understanding as what I'm seeking to create in consciousness. And then I allow my will in, but I'm not going to rush to any hasty conclusions as I sit listening for the will of God. So the waters are the fifth step with living creatures. We've talked a lot about let the birds fly above the earth, across the dome of the sky. My thoughts are words, and I'm governing them by the words that I'm choosing to think about a smashed windshield or a brother who in my human perception is not taking good care of my dad. Well, how are those thoughts holy? How are those God thoughts? And so consciously, deliberately, in my creation energy, in the womb of my consciousness, I allow only high thoughts as they carry me beyond the perception of my ego, beyond the filter of my all-knowing judgment, beyond the sense limits, really, of the body. And so then we have let the earth bring forth living creatures and make man in our image and after our likeness. This step moves directly for me out of step 5. So this is step 6. I witness various levels of awareness and phases of unfoldment in my thoughts, and I resist not. I allow those thoughts and feelings, and eventually I find it easier and easier to choose only good, uplifting thoughts exclusively. I imagine I don't play a musical instrument, but I've had to have a lot of discipline in my life as a student of life. And I imagine, like anything else, this has come through by relentless practicing, recognizing various levels and awareness of what's unfolding in my thoughts, and then choosing only the uplifting thoughts, the thoughts with God. I am gentle with myself when creeping low thoughts seek re-entry. And you know what? We can help each other with this. This week I got a call for healing support. And it is amazing to me how even in our philosophy, the ego shows up to crucify us about not using spiritual principles well enough. And for me, I have left the realm of God thoughts when I am deliberately hurting myself, punishing myself for not getting it right in some way. And so in this 6th step of being made in the image and likeness of God, I access my powers of God, God in me, to create from my pure and perfect spirit self only thoughts, only images of love, of myself, and of all others. So that's made in the image and likeness of God, of love. And as I've already said in bringing this message to a close, only after those first 6 steps have been followed am I able to consciously detach from the outcome, surrender, confident that the Christ mind in me will reveal to me the dry land of manifestation, of having created the willingness to be guided, governed, and to wait, above all, to wait upon God. And so the 7th day, the Sabbath day, is really about waiting. It's really about surrender, about yielding to the God self, the presence within me, allowing it to take over. And at this point, I let go of consciously creating. I simply bless it. I wait, watch, and listen, seeing it whole even before it emerges. And there we have the completion of a metaphysical interpretation and one possible understanding of the 7 steps that we can count on in consciousness, because those 7 steps are timeless. They are from a wisdom text, and thus in their universality, these 7 steps apply to any womb of creation that we sit with in mind. This is the truth. It is joyful. I am jubilant, and I'm grateful to share it with you and humbled as we prepare for meditation.